is that we need to, our macro models, which is what should tell us the exchange rate, tend to be inadequate to the task because they tend to be not sufficiently grounded in reality. And one way in which experiments can help us there is because by allowing us to infer the underlying micro relationships between various pieces of the macro story better. So if we actually had a better macro story, maybe we would be able to figure out the exchange rate. I'm not hugely optimistic, but at least that one could make the argument that actually maybe we should try to use experiments more in that. The main criticism of experiments, however, comes from this idea that they're not externally valid. What does externally valid mean? It means that I do an experiment here in Kenya. How do I take that result to Uganda? Why would it work in Uganda? Indeed, why would it work in the next village in Kenya? Now that's true, but it's true of every piece of empirical research. It's a point that is it's easy to make and say that, have you solved the problem of external validity? That's a problem. I think David Hume, who English philosopher, pointed this out in his essay on human understanding, which was written in 1783, I think. So it's not a point that I think is a new point. Anytime we try to learn from anything, we have to make some assumption about the world being a stable place. And if the fact that, when I put my hand in the fire, it hurts this time, doesn't imply anything in principle. There's no logical reason why it will hurt the next time. We believe something about the world, which makes us believe that if I put my hand in the fire the next time, it's still going to hurt. So it's always, that's a problem that's never, in some sense, we can never solve that problem. However, you might think that that's less of a problem if I compare. So one criticism of experiments is just comparing village A to village B. Those are just small aggregates. Why not with non-experimental data? You can't do experiments at the level of countries, but if I compare country A to country B, country A has a lot of let's say better irrigation than country B, so country A is more productive. So isn't that a better way to learn? Because at least country A is not just one village. It's true of country A, which is a big place. When I compare to country B, isn't that a better way to compare? Because I'm comparing not tiny villages but macro attributes. Now, this argument I think is fundamentally wrong. It's just sort of because when I actually compare country A to country B, it's true that country A has more, has more fertilizer usage than country B, but it's not the case that it's not that every village in country A has more fertilizer use than every village in country B. There's some villages in country A that are using fertilizer more, or irrigation, has more irrigation than country B. Now, but I can't obviously directly compare some villages, just some villages in country A with some villages in country B. So what I try to do is then I try to say, well, I'm going to compare like with like, and I start cutting the data into smaller and smaller attributes to make them comparable. So in the end, we're always forced to do the same thing, which is compare small units with small units, because those are the only things that are going to be similar. So in some sense, there is no getting around the problem that we will compare small units with small units, and therefore there is no real solution to the problem of external validity, no perfect solution. Well, indeed, one of the advantages of experiments is precisely that experiments tend to tell you exactly who you compare. So at least I know where, if you told me what are the villages you compared, like who were in the experiment, I would know. If you tell me I'm comparing country A with country B, well, I don't know where the irrigation was in country A, or maybe I could eventually find out. But when I do cross-country comparisons, I just say country A has higher irrigation, country B, it has more output, so irrigation must contribute to output. So when I do an exercise like that, I don't actually know what I'm comparing. It's precisely the fact that experiments are small that makes them much more transparent in what I'm comparing. Whereas when I compare country A with country B, I'm not actually comparing the countries, because I'm actually effectively, irrigation is only in some parts of the country, but I don't know which parts am I comparing. So that, in that sense, I think experiments are more. Now, that said, you certainly don't want to take one experiment in Kenya and apply it to India. I don't think that there's any gainsaying that fact. Now, one thing we can do is we can replicate. We can keep trying. Now, we can try, as I said, philosophically there's no real solution to the problem. Whenever I do it one more time, you can tell me, well, it worked 5 times, but why would it work the 6th time? But I think as human beings, we tend to be a little more optimistic about regularities, and so I think we do learn something from that exercise. I think the problem, to me, the one key problem with randomized experiments as they stand now is actually the following. It's not a problem, it's a problem that was been known for a long time, but I think it's a very important one in the Indian context. In India, we do a lot of experiments. I'm part of an organization called Jameel Poverty Action Lab. We have 50 experiments in India, but those 50 experiments are not with random organizations. I would say that's important. We work with organizations like Pratham. When Pratham does something, often we show it works. But Pratham is not like other organizations. Sadly, Pratham is the kind of organization which wants to do randomized controlled trials. Other organizations which maybe are less competent also don't want to do randomized controlled trials. So when we end up doing randomized controlled trials, we end up working with organizations which are inherently stronger. That's a real problem for randomized controlled trials, because it's precisely the fact that, in other words, what I'm saying is that in some sense what we want to do is do randomized controlled trials with weak organizations. The trouble is, weak organizations don't want to do randomized controlled trials because they feel that maybe their failure will be exposed. So in some sense we are in this bind where we have, I think, interesting data. We have interesting data typically from strong organizations, and that's, I think, where, if I had to think of where I think randomized controlled trials need to go, where is the current, I think, version of randomized control trial particularly weak? It's particularly weak in the fact that the results are typically from strong organizations. In other words, what we want to do now is try to persuade weaker organizations that doing a randomized control trial is in their interest, or at least we will, the global interest in doing them is sufficiently strong that they should do it, so that we actually see if the same results come from different organizations. Finally, there is and this is the point I said I will come back to, the big challenge is what question to answer. So that in the end, there's an infinity of questions. I could just take textbooks. So do I want textbooks which are 80 pages long, 90 pages long, 100 pages long? Blue, green, red, yellow, printed how? Now, do you want big letters, small letters? Pictures, no pictures? Bound, paper bound, hard bound, electronic? Do I need textbooks that are have questions at the end of a chapter, or can the questions be at the end of the book? Now, some of these questions that I'm posing, you will say those are silly questions. They can't matter. The color of the book cannot matter, or the length of the book. Maybe it matters a little bit. It really doesn't matter. What matters is whether they're covering the right material or not. Doesn't matter where you put the questions. But how do you know that? In some sense, I give that example just to illustrate the problem, but the problem is a very general one. which is that in principle there are thousands and thousands of implicit. Any decision we make, any policy question we have, has thousands and thousands of implicit questions inside them. Some of those questions we somehow think are meaningful, others we think are not meaningful. Why? Because we have a theory. Our theory says that the color of the book doesn't matter, but maybe the length of the book matters. Why do we believe that? Because we have in our mind, we have some theory. That theory, as I pointed out before, many theories we believe in may not be true. So this is a kind of a real mind. It's a real intellectual mind. It's not a mind necessarily research is founders on this question. And in some sense, it's the one where this is why theory is very important. It's very important because it tells us what is like what. So some of those theories, of course, are not going to be very interesting. They're not going to be, the length of the book, whether it matters or the color of the book doesn't matter. It's not an interesting theory, but it's a theory that matters. But in many other cases, we really struggle to decide which question to ask. Is it interesting to ask whether, for example, when we were studying the police, the example I gave you, is it important that people have, one of the interventions we looked at was whether police were given a day off a week. It turns out in India, most junior police people don't have any days off. So now, is this something where did this come from? It came from, the police, we interviewed the police, they gave us this idea. But in some sense, what that's telling us that we need a process for aggregating that information. If we go and ask police, they'll also tell us we also want higher salaries, we also want better working conditions, we want better toilets, we want better, we don't want to wear khaki pants anymore, all kinds of things. And we made a choice about what we decided to look at. At some level, there is no real solution to the problem of what question to ask. That comes out of some general principle. We make guesses. So part of what I'm saying is that I think what we really are looking for is some guidance, and this is a process by which we can be guided to ask the right question. And it's not going to come out of some abstract theory that can sort of just drop the right questions on us. It's going to come from some interaction with the world, where we integrate what we see in the world into the kinds of experiments we run. I think if I had to think of what the challenge for this kind of very empiricist view of the world is that, which is that once you abandon the comfort of theory, then just there are millions of questions, and it's not clear how we go from those millions of questions to a specific set of questions that we think are worth answering. So just to finish, I think we've learned a lot from experiments and from evaluation generally that we would not learned otherwise. I think what's very important is, because we've been there's this sort of emphasis on doing experiments. I think there's been a lot of people have gone down to the ground in a way that they never did. I think this is very important. To run an experiment, you go to a certain districts or villages, or you randomize them, you collect data there, so you actually see how the entire process functions, and that's extremely very different from downloading data from the web and running regressions. It's an entirely different perspective on the world, and it gives us sort of insights into what questions to pose and where to take things. And I think that it has done an excellent job of alerting us to how little we know and where we are particularly liable to make, irresponsible assumptions. So I think we've become much more modest as a result of it, which which is great. And I think we have gotten, the flip side of that is I think we're much more willing to ask questions. We're much more willing to say, you know, this is to sort of move over from general principles to more specific, a more specific understanding of problems one at a time. But I think it has been, I mean, it's clear that we learn from everything. We learn from correlations, we learn from walking down the street, we learn from the newspaper, we learn from sitting and thinking about things. And I think it has been extremely useful to, I think, have to set a standard for what I think is sort of a reasonable basis for knowledge. So I think what experiments has done most importantly is changed our sense of what is knowable, what questions can be asked, and what questions can be answered. I think we've become both, I think, more ambitious in asking questions and less ambitious in terms of claiming knowledge about the world, and both I think are good things. Thank you.
Since I have to be, looks as if I have to be both chairing the session and be the discussant. And given that, I think it would be a bit weird for me to have the comments first and then get the discussion from the floor. I think the best way is, let's have the discussion from the floor and let me put my comments at the end of that before Abhijit sort of responds to it. So, it's open now. And
experimental approach.
It's an experimental approach. I expected more hands than I can see. At the moment, I can't see a single hand. Okay.
Part of the dilemma seems to me to be what the physics faced in the quantum mechanics faced. You see, initially there was this feeling about certainty, that all particles behave alike. So therefore you are very sure about what path they were going to follow. You went into the micro realm, and then you are not very sure whether the electron was there at all, and then you came into the probabilistic statements. This question which you ask about why things work in one place and then they don't get externally validated is because two human beings are not identical. But then at the same time, certain broad facts do emerge and they remain constant more or less across various different nations, if you may call, or different states in India. Let me just give you an example. Irrigation, by and large within certain bounds, seems to increase agricultural productivity. And then you will start looking at deviations. Children who get their BCG right tend to get their complete immunization right. And then you will start getting deviations. Probably I think the merit of RCT will lie in looking at why deviations occur from a roughly standard pattern than saying do RCT to establish standard patterns. What would be your take on that?
Do you want to go question by question?
I
Or?
thought you were going to comment. This is an experiment. Right?
This is an experiment.
So,
Yes, please. Jana.